Well, after a lot of wrangling, EU leaders also managed to reach a last-minute deal on cutting carbon emissions. They've agreed to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 55% by the year 2030. Poland, backed by some other coal-dependent countries in Central Europe, had been holding out for guarantees on funding to pay for that transition to clean energy, but a deal was then reached. Well, with more on that, Valerie de Kemp is here from the Environment Desk. And Valerie, how significant is this 55% cut in CO2 emissions?
Well, with this new deal that countries have agreed to, basically what is happening is that the EU is basically upgrading an existing target of 40%. So going from 40% reduction in CO2 emissions to 55%. So that is a positive development. But the fact that they have presented this more ambitious plan, that in itself is not that significant. As part of their commitments under the Paris Agreement, all countries, they need to submit more ambitious pledges by the end of this year. So the fact that the EU is announcing this, well, they're just doing what they're supposed to be doing in a way. Last year, the EU announced they will be reaching net zero emissions by 2050, and that was a major announcement. And what this latest target for 2030 does, it puts the bloc on track to achieve that more ambitious objective of carbon neutrality. What I can say about the significance, perhaps, of what happened today is that it was a hard-won political compromise between wealthier countries that want more climate action, more climate ambition, and those Eastern European countries that you mentioned. They are worried that they will suffer from this green transition, and they are highly dependent on coal. That's the most important thing to mention here. Poland and other Central European countries, they fought hard through the night to obtain assurances that their economies that will not suffer disproportionate costs from the transition to a net zero economy. They also wanted more money, as you mentioned, to achieve this green transition. And the concerns of those European states, Eastern European states, they're not unfounded. We know that some 11 million jobs in Europe are at risk from the transition to a net zero economy, and most of them are in Eastern Europe. So that, we can understand why they fought hard through the night to get to that compromise, but a compromise that will still need to be approved by the European Parliament later this year.
Absolutely. OK, well, meanwhile, a new study is out today, isn't it, Valerie, that shows that emissions fell quite dramatically during the coronavirus lockdowns over the spring and parts of the summer as well. I mean, that would be down to less planes in the sky, I guess, less cars on the road?
Less planes in the sky, absolutely. I will get to that later, but we are looking at a 7% drop in CO2 emissions for 2020, and that is considerable. That is huge. Carbon emissions have dropped by 2.4 billion tons, and this has never been seen before in comparison to the fall recorded in 2009 during the global financial crisis was just 500 million tons. And I have a graph here behind me, and I will get to that later. And as you say, like pretty much everything else this year, it all comes down to COVID-19. The drop in emissions is a reflection of how the economy has been suffering from the coronavirus pandemic. Industrial activities grinding to a halt. You mentioned it. People not driving their cars because of lockdowns, not flying, etc. And the aviation industry, for example, which has been badly hit by the coronavirus pandemic, its emissions will be 40% below 2019 levels. That is huge. And I've got a graph to show you, this graph behind me. And you can see the drop around the world. In Europe, in the US, we have a fall of 11 and 12% over the year. India, 9%. So the biggest polluters in the world. And what's interesting is that the peak of this drop in emissions, it happened in the first half of April. And this was when lockdown measures were starting to come in, and they were the most comprehensive, especially in Europe. And France, for example, which put in place some of the more stringent restrictions in the world, well, they saw a fall of 15%. That's the biggest drop in the world here in France. That being said, there is one country that is not following the trend, and that is China. China, which saw a fall in emissions of just 1.7%, and that's because they experienced a big drop in emissions in March, February, at the beginning of this whole pandemic, and then the country bounced back pretty quickly, and they reached a level of emissions that is similar to that of 2019. So is this going to last? The answer is probably not. Well, we know that it is not going to last. Analysts now agree that emissions will bounce back for sure in 2021. And although the numbers now are pretty positive, scientists say that in order to meet the Paris, the objectives of the Paris Agreement, every year countries as a whole would have to cut down emissions by 2 billion tons every year for the next decade. So that's almost the same amount that we cut back this year.
So we'd have to have a lockdown every year to meet those targets. So, all right then. Probably not. Valerie, thank you very much indeed. Valerie de Kemp there.